So with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Eric Gervin from the University of Oregon. He's going to talk to us about understanding and addressing implicit bias. Thank you, everyone. Have a really great conference.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you're having a chance to enjoy your lunch. So I'm here to talk about implicit bias, and I want to give a little bit of background about me because it will help maybe understand the topic. A lot of you may be familiar with it. We're going to dive a little bit more deeply into it. So as you can tell, as from the main slide here, right, those little letters after my name, I actually have two professional hats. So I do teach. I'm a professor at the University of Oregon School of Law. I teach on the civil side mostly in litigation, not the criminal side. And I've been doing that for about 7 years. Before that, I did practice law for 7 years. And between those, I stopped and got a PhD in psychology, which is my other professional hat. And if you're familiar with the areas of psychology, I'll say it's in social psychology. If you're not familiar with the areas of psychology, you probably think of psychology as clinical psychology or counseling psychology, the kind of psychiatry talking to somebody about their mothers or whatever, right? Social psychology is not that. Social psychology is a behavioral science looking at studying how behavior occurs. And the main insight from social psychology is that, surprise, surprise, situations affect our behavior. Right? If we talk to somebody, we know somebody who's really outgoing, their behavior is actually different maybe when they're in church or at a funeral than when they're at a party. Right? What outgoing means changes by situation. The law is actually a situation. Right? It's something we do. We try to pass laws and design our systems in order to affect behavior. Hopefully reduce crime, increase public safety. Right? That's the idea. So one of the things that I study is how the things that we do affect behaviors, whether they're effective or not. And one of the behaviors that I study a lot of is about discrimination. How it is that we treat people differently based on the characteristics that they have. And so that's what implicit bias is about. And so I want to start off with just a few examples of that from some research. One of them, this came out of the Chicago Police Accountability Task Force and their report looking at the Chicago Police Department's data. But they found that Black and Hispanic drivers were searched approximately 4 times as often as white drivers. Yet the Chicago Police Department's own data showed that contraband was found on white drivers twice as often as Black and Hispanic drivers. We have, to our own Criminal Justice Commission, they found that in 2015, controlling for estimates of rates of drug use, Black Oregonians were more than 3.5 times more likely than white Oregonians to be convicted of felony drug use. Right? There actually aren't large differences in the rates at which people from different racial and ethnic groups use drugs, but there are pretty large differences in the rate in which they're arrested and ultimately incarcerated. One of the areas that I work in a lot is with school discipline, looking at racial disparities in school discipline. By federal statute, schools have been required to report this information since the 1970s. So you can see that in that 1972-73 school year, Black children were suspended or expelled at about twice the rate of white children. About 6% of Black children, about 3% of white children. Currently, it's close to 4 times the rate. Right, so this is an issue that's gotten a lot worse, this discrepancy, over a period of time when race relations and other things have supposedly gotten a lot better. And that raises questions about why, right? What's going on? This is a study that was done thinking about the professional world, because I also like to think about the worlds that I work in. This was done in a law firm. And what they did was they wanted to look at how race affects the decisions of supervisors, law firm partners. So what they did was they showed them a memo that was written supposedly by one of the associates, one of the junior new members of their team. Half of them thought that the memo was written by somebody who was African American. Half of them thought it was written by somebody who was white. And what they found is that the people who thought that they were reading a memo that was somebody who was white actually rated that memo better. Right, gave it an 80% as opposed to a 60% on average. The people who saw the same work product but thought it was written by an African American associate actually found twice as many spelling mistakes in that memo, right, and other mistakes for the exact same product. Other comments that they wrote on them when they thought that it was a white worker there, generally a good writer, but they need to work on something. They have potential, good analytical skills, For those who read that same thing but thought it was a black associate, needs lots of work, can't believe he went to NYU, average at best. Right, these ideas for the exact same work product. We can also talk a little bit about other areas. This is race, and I'll talk a lot about a lot of different areas because there's a lot of different areas where we tend to make differences, or people tend to make differences like this. But one of them that comes up a lot is women in leadership. So the New York Times put together what they call the glass ceiling index. This is actually copying off of a study that was done a long time before. So if you take the Fortune 500, so you think about 500 largest companies in the country, something like that, these are the portraits of the women who are CEOs of those companies, at least as the beginning of 2018, right? So there are 500 companies, and these are the, 25 women who run them. These are the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies named John. Right. So this is true, notwithstanding the fact that women have been graduating from business schools at the same or even higher rates than men since the 1980s. Right, and so part of the question is just why, right? Why do we have these differences? And by understanding why we have these differences, we can do a better job of creating what we think of as meaningful equal opportunity and having our decisions line up better with our values. Other ways, when we talk about race, we talk about sex, you can also talk about poverty, socioeconomic class. This is another study that was done in the legal world. Basically, they had some researchers posed as graduate law students applying for jobs in large law firms. And they had the exact same credentials that they set in looking for those job opportunities, with two differences, right? Some of them were men and some of them were women. And the other thing that changed is some of them put indications in their resumes that they came from a wealthy background. So they've been the captain of a sports team associated with a country club, for example. And others put indications in their resumes that they maybe didn't. So they'd been the captain of the sports team, maybe associated with the YMCA or something. And what we see is, although they had the exact same qualifications, right, and the law firms didn't know that this was a study, they had the exact same qualifications, the vast majority of offers went to men who came from high-class backgrounds, even though they all had the same class ranks, the same schools, the same other qualifications, the things we'd think of as merit. So these kinds of things, this research suggests, affects our decision-making, and that's what we really want to talk about today when we talk about implicit bias. There's a lot of explanations for some of these kinds of effects. So we can talk about historical discrimination, we can talk about preferences, we can talk about structural biases and things that come up. And if I were here with different backgrounds and had more than 45 minutes, we could talk about a lot of those. What we're going to focus on here, though, is implicit bias, which you can think of as, it has to do with the way our brains process information. And one way I would like to get you to think about it is to think about it as expectations. Right? Our expectations affect what information we look for. They affect what kind of information we gather, what questions we ask, and how we go about doing basically around our lives. And those expectations can be explicit. They can be ones that we know that we're having. And they can also be implicit or automatic, meaning they can be non-conscious, right, outside of our conscious awareness. And when we talk about implicit bias, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these outside of our conscious awareness expectations that lead us to behave in ways that often are inconsistent with our values and how we'd want to be treating if we're treating people equally. So how does it work? I want to go to a quick exercise. I've been kind of lecturing at you for a while. As much as I like to hear myself talk, I would like to have you get involved. So hopefully you've had a chance to eat a little bit. This quick exercise should be pretty easy. This is the basic idea. I want you to look at this image. I want to know by show of hands, how many people would say that that square near the top marked with the letter A looks darker to you than the square marked with B? Should be pretty easy. Go ahead and raise your hand high, right? Be proud. All right, good. How many people will say that the square marked with B looks darker in color than the square marked with A? And how many people say they look the same? So you got a few of those. Okay, great. It turns out that those squares are exactly the same color, right? Exactly. I don't mean the letter in them. I mean the actual square. The reason that most people don't see them as the same color is because most of us, well, all of us, don't actually see the world the way it is. We just see the world the way that our senses and our brain interprets it. And one of the things that our brain does to deal with all of the complex amount of information that we have to deal with every day is that it uses shortcuts. So this is an example, and we can think of those shortcuts as expectations, but this is an example where what your brain does when you're looking at this image is it looks at the adjacent information. So those squares that are next to the a square are a little bit lighter than the a square, and the squares that are next to the b square are a little bit darker than the b square. And given that information, that context, your brain expects that those are two different colored squares. And so it adjusts how you see them and interpret them. That's what's happening. So I've given you kind of a technical explanation. How many people believe me that they're the same color? I think I have even less people believing me than before I gave the explanation. So that's good, but you know what? You don't have to take my word for this, right? That wouldn't be any good. I'm a scientist, and we have to test things, right? We're constant skeptics. So I'm going to show you. So what I did was I opened that just on my screen earlier, and I recorded it. And what I'm going to do is cut out that a square and drag it down to the b square so that you can see. So here's a little video of it. That yellow circle is my cursor. And you'll note also I'm going to get a little bit of the square adjacent to the a square, so you can't accuse me of cheating by changing the color, right? Because the relative difference will stay the same. And just drag it down so you can see that they're in fact the exact same color. Still the same color. If notwithstanding my explanation, you think that somehow I cheated because I have more technological savvy than I actually possess, here's just simple PowerPoint animation. Both of those squares are the same color as that gray bar. So I can just move it over, and you can see it. The main takeaway point here, and what we're talking about when we talk about implicit bias, is that if you were making decisions about those two squares, and you treated them differently, you would actually be discriminating, because they're actually the same color, even if you don't see them that way. And so when we talk about implicit bias, this is what we're talking about, is how the non-conscious parts of our brains and processing information can affect our perceptions, judgments, and decision-making that actually can produce different outcomes than maybe we would want or desire. So why do our brains do this, right? Why do our brains have these shortcuts? I mentioned a little bit earlier that it does it because the world is a really complicated place. And so what our brain does to handle that is it automatically categorizes the world, everything in the world, millions of times a day, constantly, outside of our conscious awareness, categorizing stuff. That's what our brain does. And so it simplifies the world that way. Again, I don't want you to take my word for it, so I'm going to do something to try to illustrate that point. I'm going to press this button, and an image of some things are going to come up here on the screen nearest to you, and I want you to yell out what it is you see. Okay, I recognize that I just opened with an optical illusion, so my credibility is totally shot. But you're going to have to bear with me, right? Be a little courageous, because the whole idea of this is that it should be trivially easy for you to identify what these are, right? Because your brain is so good at this. So here we go. What are these? Good job. Thanks to everyone who yelled out chairs, right? The courageous. So they are chairs. That was really easy. Takes less than a second, no problem. Now, if you look at them a little more closely, you'll recognize that you've probably never seen a chair that looks like any of them, and they actually look quite differently from one another. Still, trivially easy to identify them as chairs. This is what your brain's doing constantly, right? Taking different information, and that turns out to be really useful because you could walk into a room like this, carrying your lunch, talking to your colleague, and know what the chairs are without even thinking about it, right? And how to use them. It simplifies our world a lot, right, to be able to do this as opposed to have to individually process every single thing we come across. We couldn't actually function if we did that. Okay, I've got one more. So what are these? Dogs, great, yes, so dogs. And that turns out to be really good to be able to identify them. I have a couple of kids, elementary school age. Well, my son started middle school, so that's been fun. And we would go hiking. You might go to the park, and you see dogs, and they want to run up and hug the dog. And I can talk to them and say, you know, it's OK to pet dogs, but first thing you have to do is talk to the owner, or maybe approach it this way, and be careful, it might bite, right? Those kinds of rules. And it doesn't matter whether the dog has long hair or short hair, right? The rules apply. Also, if you had a child in kindergarten or first grade who couldn't identify the difference between a dog and, say, a cow, right? So four-legged creatures roughly look the same. We would actually be worried about their cognitive processing, right? They would go see a specialist to try to help them do that, because this categorization thing that we do is essential, right? It's really fundamental to how our brains handle the world. But it can have unintended consequences because it sets up expectations. right? It sets up expectations that all chairs are the same when we're not really thinking about it, or all dogs are the same when we're not really thinking about it. And if we behave that way towards individuals, we can end up producing results that we don't want. One more demonstration about this. Because, again, our brain is so good at it, we forget of how hard and complex it is. So this one's going to involve some different kinds of information. It's called the Stroop task. If you have a psychology background, you might be aware of it because it's been around for about 90 years. I didn't make this stuff up. Works on two pieces of information that we automatically understand. So we know that we can automatically understand the meaning of a color word. Those letters G-R-E-E-N spell the concept green. If you're fluent in English, you'll just see them and understand that they mean the concept green. It'll be automatic, right? Effortless. That's what it means to read fluently. Keep in mind, though, that wasn't always the case. When you were learning to read, it was very effortful to sound out all the letters, match it to a concept you know, right, and really slow. But after a lot of practice, it becomes automatic. Right? That's the way it works. Same thing with those X's in the second line. Right? We automatically know the color in which a word is displayed. If you're not colorblind, you'll see those X's and recognize that they're green. Also, that was not always automatic. You had to learn at some point in your life what the color green was, what other people call it, how to match it with things that you see, but now it's automatic. Right? So you have two pieces of information that you can get automatically. Those can either help each other or get in each other's way, depending on whether they're the same or different. I'm going to state that in different terms, because this will be about the exercise we're going to do. It should be quick and easy for you to correctly identify the color in which this word is displayed, green. Why? Because you can rely entirely on the automatic information you get. Right? You get information from the letters and the color that's the same. It should be slower and harder to correctly identify the color in which this word's displayed, red. Right? Because the information you get from the letters and the information you get from the color that they're in are not the same. And so your brain has to take some time to sort out what it is you really want. So that's the idea. But again, we're not going to take my word for it. We're going to try it. So here we go. I have to teach you a skill. It's the only skill you'll need for the next 90 seconds. And that's the ability to say out loud the color in which words are written. So you got that? So what I'm going to do is we're going to start with the first word over there, improve. Find your nearest screen. And we're going to say out loud the color in which they're written, just working our way across and then move on to the second line. We got it? All right, let's just start with the first one. Red, yellow, green, brown, blue, pink, red, yellow. Maybe, depending on the screen and the resolution. We go purple or pink on that one. Okay. So that's good. We got the basic idea down. And that was nice, because we're friendly, collegial, right? And so we can say them all together. What we're going to do next is not as friendly and collegial. It's actually a competition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a screen full of color words, and I want you to be the fastest one at your table to accurately read all the colors in which they're in. Now, I love looking around and seeing people's body language change, right? Because you can tell who's actually competitive and do this. And you probably know the one, right, who's sitting there. You do that. If for whatever reason you're not motivated by competition, I'll just tell you this. Those double zeros at the top will count to 20. So try to do it in faster than 20 seconds. And I'll say that people who do this quite quickly can do it in under 12 seconds. So you might use that as your personal goal. So you have to charge ahead, right, and get it done. But I'll definitely ask afterwards who did it in under 12 seconds. So that's your idea. So remember the color in which these are written. Anyone not ready? All right, here you go. All right. So that was pretty good. I promised I'd ask, so I want to know, by show of hands, how many people were able to finish in under 12 seconds? All right, so good. We have a few. Congratulations to them. So what we're going to do now, as you might imagine, because I know you were paying attention 2 slides ago, is I'm going to show you a screen full of color words that have the exact same words formatted in the exact same way, but the color of the letters and the color in which they're written are not going to match. Right? That said, that is what we're going to do. That is how an experiment works, right? Okay, so what we're going to do is have you do the exact same thing you've done twice now, which is just say the color in which the words are written. You got a chance to practice that. Hopefully you took advantage of it. You got a chance to do it on the last slide. Should be easy, right? We've done it twice. And you got to try to beat that 12 seconds. Or anyway, at least 20 seconds, because otherwise, I don't know, eternal shame or something, right, for 20 seconds? Okay, everyone ready? Here you go. So it turns out that second time around's harder, right, for most people. You're in good company, though, because that's most people, again, for like the last 90 years who have tried this. Right? Why? Because when those two pieces of information are the same, like the first part of the Stroop task that we did, you can use those automatic processes. Right? There's nothing that's contrary to your expectations. You get what you're looking for. The second part, though, you end up having a conflict. Right? Your brain doesn't expect those two things to be paired together. It goes against those automatic processes, and it forces you to take time to think about it. So that's what we get, right? Our thinking is easier when the meaning of the word and the color in which it's written are consistent than when they're inconsistent. But that's also true of other things, and that's what implicit bias is like, right? When the world is consistent with, or can be interpreted in a way that's consistent with our automatic expectations, it feels natural and easy. Right? When things are not consistent with those expectations, it's disruptive, it's harder to think about, and it can cause issues. So when we think about implicit bias, I guess things that I want you to think about is it is this tendency to automatically categorize people. In the same way we categorize chairs, right? Our brains work the same, it doesn't really distinguish. We categorize things. And then we evaluate them positively or negatively, or assume that they have certain characteristics based on the stereotypical characteristics of groups into which we automatically place them. That's how implicit bias works. And we can think about them, right? All of our brains categorize. Most of us are aware of social stereotypes or things that categories go into. It's like the idea that construction workers are typically associated, that occupation is associated with men. I think it's one of, research suggests, it's one of the most stereotypically masculine jobs out there. But there are others, right? Including law enforcement, judging, surgeons, right? A lot of other things that we can think of that are stereotypically masculine jobs. We know from a lot of research on stereotyping that African Americans, particularly men, tend to be associated with being athletic or criminal. People who are poor, right? There tend to be associations between them being either lazy or dishonest. And women tend to be associated with being nurturing, right? More than men. We have these associations. And the idea of implicit bias is it doesn't matter if these are accurate, and it doesn't even matter if you consciously agree with them or not. If our brains have learned to make those associations, that kind of expectation, it will affect the way that we see things and how we approach them and what questions we ask and what we do with them, right? In a way that can lead to unequal treatment. I mentioned before the difference between this implicit bias and explicit bias. So psychologists consider explicit bias to be something that somebody would believe or consciously endorse. Like if I were to ask somebody, thinking of that women and nurturing example, should men be breadwinners and women be stay-at-home moms? Right? There are people who would say, yeah, that's definitely the way it should work. That's an explicit bias, right? That's a view that somebody would consciously endorse. Other people might say, absolutely not, right? People can work if they want to. You can have two breadwinners, two not. You can be stay-at-home dads. All of that can work, right? That's your explicit belief. Implicit bias is neither of those. In fact, it actually tends not to be related to explicit beliefs at all. There's a couple of things that you should be aware of about that. One of them is that having explicit beliefs that we should have equality and equal opportunity doesn't mean that you actually have no implicit bias. Right? And it means that if somebody is engaging in discrimination, to the extent it's implicit bias, it may not be an indication of their explicit beliefs at all. And it makes sense to think of them as racist or sexist as we might traditionally understand it. So to illustrate this idea, I have a quote from the Reverend Jesse Jackson, civil rights luminary. Spends his life working for racial equality and has for a long time, like undeniably explicit racial egalitarian. In a speech in 1993, he said this: "There's nothing more painful to me than to walk down the street and hear footsteps and start thinking about robbery, then look around and see somebody white and feel relieved." And you can't imagine how painful that would be. That understanding that at a gut level, he has this race-based association with who's safe or not. Right? For someone who believes that people should be treated racially equal. When we think about implicit bias then, and we think about these stereotypes, a question that comes up pretty often is, well, how is this bias? Okay, the implicit part means it's outside of our conscious awareness. That's what it means. But how is it biased? So I have an example here that I want to discuss briefly to give an idea of what we mean by bias. Because by bias, I don't mean prejudice. Right? I don't mean prejudice in the sense of somebody has like a hatred towards a group. What I mean by bias is something that leads us to make mistakes that systematically affect one group or favor another, right? So here's an example that I'll use, which has to do with foot speed. We might have a stereotype that men are faster than women. That stereotype actually turns out to be true in the aggregate, right? Your average man is faster than your average woman. So to illustrate that, because I love playing with data, I went and found some 5K turkey trot data from Chicago, Illinois. And this is the distributions of the times. So that purple or the blue distribution, those are the finish times of men. The red one is of women, and the purple overlap is the overlap. A couple things you'll notice, the difference between their average times is 2.1 minutes. Men on average were 2.1 minutes faster to complete the 5K than women. So that's our stereotype, right? In the aggregate, it's true, 2.1 minutes. Does that mean that no women are faster than men? Doesn't mean that at all. There's a huge amount of overlap in that. And so when we think about it, let's use this thought experiment. You're standing at the front of that race. And what you need to do is pick two people at random, one man and one woman, and you're going to make a bet on who's going to finish faster. Right? Or maybe you're hiring someone, right? You're going to select which one of them's faster, and you're just going to do it based on the fact that one's a man and one's a woman. Okay, so that's our exercise. Say we rely on the stereotype, that aggregate. I can tell, because I can compute it, that what's going to happen is you'll be right 65% of the time if you pick a man, and you'll be wrong 35% of the time. Okay, so that's better than a coin toss. So it means there's no information there. But think about this for a moment. Every time you're wrong, who are you wrong in favor of? Every time you're wrong, who are you in favor of? A man, right? And not just any man, but probably a man who spends no time running and spends a lot of time watching television and eating potato chips, right? And every time you're wrong, who are you deciding against? Who's harmed by that? A woman, every time. Your errors, when your mistakes, are systematic. They don't equally affect two groups, right? And the women that you're hurting are who? They're women who spend time running and trying to be good. Right? So if we unthinkingly apply that stereotype, we're going to systematically, it's biased because we're systematically hurting one group and favoring another. And maybe just the ones we don't want to. Of course, what we would do, right, as rational actors is not use their sex to pick who's winning. We should ask them how fast they are. That's the information you actually want. But when implicit biases affect our judgment, we don't stop and think about getting the right information. We just act as if those stereotypes are true, and it leads to biased judgments. So our perceptions are biased by context. I'll give you an example. I mentioned before that construction is a stereotypically masculine job. If you look at employment discrimination cases, there actually aren't that many brought by men in traditionally or stereotypically masculine jobs. Nursing, as I have up there, is a stereotypically female job associated with marine nurturing, right? That's the idea. And there aren't that many employment discrimination cases brought by women in stereotypically or traditionally female jobs. Most of the employment discrimination cases we have are the opposite, right? Women in traditionally masculine roles and men in traditionally female ones. And if you think about it, these are the folks who are living and working in that second part of the Stroop task you did. Their characteristics don't line up with what people automatically expect or associate with somebody in that role. That's where we have problems in our decisions. So what I want you to do is take a second at your table. We don't have too much time. And just think about or talk to your neighbor about how you would define implicit bias in your own words to somebody who wasn't at this presentation. So just take about a minute and do that. Pick a neighbor and do that. And then we'll come back and I'll talk through some of the effects of implicit bias. Okay, if you could start to wrap up your thought. So the reason I have you do this exercise is not just to make sure you're awake now that your stomach is full right after lunch. Well, that may be part of it. But part of it is my goal, thinking what can we do in 45 minutes on implicit bias, is just to get people talking about it. And one thing that's important about getting people to talk about it is that that often can lead to us thinking critically and constructively about how we can help address implicit bias in ourselves. That's the hope. So I'm going to give you a couple pieces of information really quickly, which is being aware of implicit bias, like attending a session like this where somebody tells you what implicit bias is, doesn't actually help anything at all. We know, I'm an empirical researcher. I do studies on this kind of thing. It doesn't help. Right? Awareness doesn't help. What has to happen, if we're going to make a difference, is we have to actually change the way we go about making our decisions, which often means changing our policies and practices in our workplaces, right, or other ways that we do it. Now, awareness, of course, can let us know that maybe that's something we ought to be doing, but itself, it just doesn't get us all the way there. So let's think about implicit bias, when it affects our judgments, and just briefly the kinds of things that we might do about it. So first things first, what kind of judgments does implicit bias influence? What I'm going to do is just go quickly through a set of studies that are about judgments in professional settings, right? So you can think about these kinds of settings where people have found evidence. So first one, this was a set of studies that was done in technology firms, using HR managers doing interviews. And what they found is that the interviewers' implicit biases predicted the extent to which they discriminate against Arab, Muslim, and obese job applicants in actual jobs. Right? Second one, every election year, political scientists do a study called the American National Election Study. And they do that so that they can get information to study who votes and why and those kinds of things, voter participation, et cetera. The 2008 National Election Study measured implicit racial bias. I worked on a pilot study related to this, and what we found is that you could predict the extent to which registered Democrats did not vote for Barack Obama with their implicit race biases. I should point out that this didn't work for registered Republicans, and that makes a lot of sense as we think about when implicit bias affects our judgments, because the best predictor of voting behavior is party identification. Not surprising, right? Republicans vote for Republicans and Democrats vote for Democrats. So what we're predicting here is not why would a Republican vote for a Democrat. What we're predicting here is why Democrats would not vote for their own party candidate. Set of studies showed that teachers' implicit biases were related to the extent to which they expected their minority students to perform more poorly than non-minority students, the actual gap in performance of those students on standardized tests. Sample of pediatricians, right? These are doctors who have dedicated their life to helping children. Their implicit race biases predicted the extent to which they recommended less pain medication than for black children than white children with identical symptoms. Sample of California, Phil Goff did this study. Police officers found that their implicit race biases predicted the extent to which they use force when arresting black children as opposed to white children. Closest I've ever gotten to judges, we did a sample of arbitrators. So these were people who decide if you're a member of a union, you get fired, you want to challenge that decision. These are the people who would decide that case. We got a sample of arbitrators, got them to measure their implicit sex biases, and found that those predicted the extent to which they decided labor grievances in favor of women in their actual cases. Right, so we have reason to believe that these implicit biases actually do have some influence, even in professional settings. In order to try to get to stopping that, this is the kind of framework that we use. Just we can think about we have implicit biases, and we can think about how they lead to disproportionate outcomes that we might not want. They might be inconsistent with our values or even our laws. Right? But that doesn't happen all the time. It happens in certain kind of situations. Right? Certain situations open and close that valve, or that act as a gate to open and allow implicit bias through. So that gives us two things to target if you're trying to reduce the effects of implicit bias. The first is your implicit biases themselves. So how do we do that? There's a lot of research that suggests this is extremely difficult, which makes a lot of sense, because if you spend a life learning from your culture or developing associations between things from your culture, the fact that you could maybe do something for an hour and it would undo all of it, right? That's ridiculous. So there aren't really one-shot solutions. The kinds of solutions that could potentially work and that there's evidence for are essentially getting into the habit of trying to counter these. So this is thinking about getting into a habit of countering any stereotypical portrayals that you have, and the following motivated reasoning, which is a psychological term for, remember I talked about expectations? For implicit bias, is we expect things to happen, and motivated reasoning leads us to go look for evidence that that actually happened, as opposed to challenging it, right? Thinking critically. So some examples. Since we're here at Conference on Justice Reinvestment, I'd use an example of this. So this is media coverage in Ferguson after the shooting death of Michael Brown. And we probably all remember this, and remember a lot of this media coverage. And we probably also remember that there are a lot of narratives, a lot of ways people frame or understand what was going on there. And some of those narratives were things like the birth of a civil rights movement and concerns about the militarization of the police. And some of them were about groups of people tearing down small-town America and the thin blue line being the last thing to protect them, right? If we think about those kinds of debates, right, that continue in our culture and those kinds of frames, how they relate to the stereotypes people have and their expectations, what I do is take a step back and say, around the same time this was happening, there was another place, probably several, but this is one of them, another place where police were responding in riot gear to people who were causing lots of property damage that didn't get very much coverage in the news. Where was this? This is riot cops using tear gas on revelers, people celebrating too much in Columbus, Ohio, after Ohio State beat the Oregon Ducks in the national title game in football. Right? This, unlike Ferguson, is in the media as a party that got out of hand. But it's still people destroying property and still police responding. And actually, right, while we may have built-in expectations or stereotypes from media coverage of things like Ferguson, it actually turns out it's not hard to find situations that are contrary to racial and law enforcement underpinnings of that. So I'm just going to go through a few. This is in Vancouver, right, after their hockey team lost. This is in Lexington, Kentucky, because their basketball team won. This is in San Francisco because their baseball team won. This is in Huntington Beach because of the surf competition. Right? This is in Denver because their football team lost. This is in Keene, New Hampshire because of the pumpkin festival, right? It turns out it's actually not hard to find these counter-stereotypical examples, right? Of property destruction by people that don't look like the folks who were marching in Ferguson, and police responding to them, right? And part of it is just learning to understand that we have stereotypes and expectations around what's happening, and that there actually aren't right? Like the people running in the 5K, there's actually a lot of overlap, right? Particular behaviors are not the province of particular kinds of individuals. They aren't. Like you can study just about any human behavior, and there tends to be way more within group differences than between group differences. Again, think back to the slide about the foot speed, right? The speed difference between the fastest and slowest man is way larger than the difference between the average man and the average woman. And so when we unthinkingly rely on those stereotypes, we throw all of that difference out, right? Which is most of the difference. And so it's learning to catch yourself and find those counter-stereotypical examples and thinking about it. So this is the idea. When you recognize that you've had or witnessed a stereotypical depiction, you should label it as stereotypical, and then try to replace that stereotype with a counter-stereotypical example or something that makes it egalitarian. And you have to arm yourself with these examples again, because they're not necessarily what we're fed. So I have just a couple of other examples for it. If I ask you to think of a biochemist, and you think of a white guy in a lab coat, right? Or if I ask you to think of an astronaut and you think of Buzz Aldrin, right? Maybe next time you're supposed to think about an astronaut, think about Dr. Peggy Whitson, because she's a biochemist. She's also a US astronaut, and she was arguably actually our best astronaut because she has our record for the longest time in space. So she might be our best actually person to think of when you think about an astronaut, right? Or when you think about combat pilots, right? In the military, you can think about Martha McSally. She's colonel, now senator. She was appointed to replace, be in John McCain's seat after he died. But she flew A-10s, right, in combat. This is an example, right? It's thinking about the fact that these things are not, well, they have stereotypes. They're not really the province of particular demographic categories. Second thing you can do is think about your decision situations. So what I do when I work with organizations, a lot of them, is this two-step process. We think about what parts of our jobs or decision processes are vulnerable to the influence of implicit bias. We think about them as vulnerable decision points. And then we try to work on those specific vulnerable decision points by changing our policies and practices. Make specific changes, because it's not about awareness, it's about those changes. So what are vulnerable decision points? What you need to do when you're doing this is think about really specific decisions that have one of these characteristics. They're ambiguous or discretionary with multiple justifiable outcomes. So what is that like? Say you're hiring somebody. You come down to two candidates. One of them has a slightly better educational background. The other one has slightly more work experience. You're not sure how to weight those two. You know that you could actually hire either of them, go back to your supervisor, and your supervisor would say, congratulations. Right now you're in a vulnerable decision point because you have discretion. You could justify either decision. Right? It's up to you. So what happens? We start talking about fit, right? And those sorts of things. That's where implicit biases are putting the thumb on the scale of our decisions. Right? How about situations under time pressure, stress, fatigue, when you're angry, or you don't have that much information? This could be triage decisions, right? It could be when you're really tired. What fills in the information that we don't have? Those implicit associations, right, and those expectations. That's what fills them in. So those are where we're vulnerable. And then unconscious behaviors, right, is another one. So once you've identified one of these vulnerable decision points, what do? Let me go back one. There we go. Here's a set of 4 things. We don't have time to talk about them all. But basically, you can remove some of the irrelevant information. You can reduce some of the ambiguity in what decisions you make. You can develop and use what we call neutralizing routines. And you can collect data. Because without data, it's really hard to tell a lot of times when you're doing well and when you're not. So what does that look like? I'm just going to go through 2 of them quickly. Blinded evaluation procedures, that's removing that irrelevant information. I know you wanted to see this again, right? Everybody happy? Okay, good. So those 2 squares are still the same color. Imagine this was a test. And I said to you, right, are those squares the same color or not? That's your job, is to evaluate that. What information on this slide is actually relevant to deciding whether those 2 squares are the same color? To hear it out there? Just the squares. Let's just remove everything else. Right? It turns out those contextual features often bias our judgments. And removing them, when you can, is a good idea. The most common example of this in professional world is orchestras. People have heard about this example a lot. It used to be that orchestras were entirely composed of men. Composed, kind of a pun, but anyway, all right. I got a groan, so that was good. Okay, so then somebody got the bright idea that we don't actually care who's playing, we care how they sound. So what do? Professional orchestras started having blind auditions. Why is this a vulnerable decision point? If you think about it, nobody auditions for a professional orchestra who's bad at playing their instrument. You're not trying to decide between a first-year trumpet player and somebody who's been playing for 30 years professionally. That's easy, right? There's no implicit bias. We're not worried about that. What we're worried about it is when you have people who are all really good. And then we're worried that our own idiosyncratic preferences might affect our judgments, as well as things that ought not to matter, like the demographic characteristics of the person who's playing. So you're in this setting, and you set up a screen, right? So you have your audition. You get other people to help you decide, so you can make sure it's not just your preferences that drive the decision. And you start off, and you write out, send in the first applicant, thinking, great, we've solved this vulnerable decision point. And then you hear high heels walking across the floor. And you think to yourself, oh, because you just got information you actually shouldn't have. Right? They could bias your judgment. And that happened. And that would happen in Colorado Springs, right? This is that Colorado Springs. What happened there? So you got a couple of choices then. You can throw up your hands and say this work is too difficult. Or you can think more constructively about your vulnerable decision point and say, maybe we just ought to lay out carpeting. Or give them all slippers. And actually professional orchestras do all those things to try to come up with practical ways to remove that information. So I talk a lot to legal community around these things, and there's a couple of ideas that I've come up with talking to federal judges. One of them mentioned that the first 2 pages of the information that he gets when he's doing sentencing is, guess what? A description of the suspect. Why do I need that? Just have my clerk tear it off so that I can actually look at the facts and not see who it is. Similar things oftentimes in forensic labs. The person doing a fingerprint match and have access to a description of the suspect and what crime they're accused of. And some crimes are more stereotypical of certain groups than others. And there's research that suggests that that actually affects whether people make matches or not. It just shouldn't be there. If you're matching fingerprints, just match fingerprints. Right? Those are the kinds of things that we can do. So that's the idea. I have a recommendation, and when it's practical, in hiring or other of these kinds of decisions, remove irrelevant information. Second one that I'll go through in more detail is this reducing ambiguity. Sometimes you can't actually remove the irrelevant information. But you can maybe just do a better job of figuring out what it is, the information that's actually relevant, and just focus on that information. So here's an example that I use. This is drug interdiction data from the US Customs Service from 1998. The blue bars are graphing all the people that they searched coming off of airplanes in the United States for drugs that year. The little black bars next to the blue bars are the number of hits. So to summarize, about 33,000 searches for 1,251 hits, giving them over an overall effectiveness rate of just under 4%, which is that red line composite over on the other axis. I don't really fault them for only having a 4% hit rate, because this is really hard. People are trying to smuggle drugs. They're trying not to be found, right? That makes it a hard decision. The real problem here actually comes from the racial and ethnic difference. Their hit rate was 6% for white people, 6% for black people, but only 1% for Latina people, which when you're looking at data is suggestive of some kind of bias. Effectively, there was something about those Latina people that caused people to suspect them more, but the overall searches didn't justify those extra expectations or searches, right? More errors. Is that systematic error problem. So they realized this was a problem because they got sued. That sometimes does it. And to their credit, what they did was look at their decisions. And what they said was, how can we figure out what we're doing? And what they realized is that they were training their officers to look at something like 45 different things when they would make a search decision. That ends up being pretty vulnerable because nobody can keep 45 things in their head at one time. And often you could just select one of them to justify a search for just about anybody. Now you have a lot of discretion. So they said, all right, well, let's change this up. they did some research and came up with 8 cues that they were going to use that would justify a search. 8. Trained their officers to use them, said if you're going to search somebody, what you need to do is call your supervisor and say, and list one of these 8 things that I saw to get permission to do a search. So they did. So here they are 2 years later. They do 8,000 searches, about 1,204 hits, so almost the same number of drugs. Their overall hit rate's gone up to 15%. And for the bias portion, the ethnic difference has gone down considerably. They're just doing a better job of finding the right people. So that's the idea. What you want to do when you can is before you conduct any evaluations, try to define what it is that you're trying to look for, right? Whether it's in hiring or other things, and then figure out what part of your process you're going to use to get that information. And then actually use that to make your decisions. That doesn't mean you can't later go back and debrief it and figure out where you went wrong and make adjustments, and you should do that. You definitely should do that, but not on the fly in the middle of the process. Then the last thing I said, right, that I'll just close with, is this idea that we need to build in evaluation feedback. Like, data is important. One of the things about implicit bias is that it's really hard to tell when it's affecting you. So for even very well-meaning people, without collecting data, very, very difficult to know. So you collect data to see how you're doing. You collect data to celebrate your successes. Because even in vulnerable decision points, a lot of times we make really good decisions that are unbiased. And we should celebrate that. And we should figure out why we're doing it, because we also will find out areas where we're not doing well. And maybe there's something about the areas we're doing well that we can use in those areas. And then when we're using that information, when we're making changes, we need a way to monitor our progress to see if we're going in the right direction. And so we need data to do that. So that's the idea, my hope, is that you'll take this and you'll think about what vulnerable decision points you have and what practical things you could do to try to address them. Thank you.